For 1 week, the world watched to see if Ukraine would open a brand new front in this war. On June 19, 2026, Volodymyr Zelenskyy stood at a press conference in Kyiv and did something he had never done before. He gave a direct, public, dated ultimatum to a foreign head of state who is not Russia. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, on June 19th, accused Belarus of facilitating Russian drone attacks on Ukraine and warned that Minsk has 1 week to remove communications equipment allegedly helping guide strikes from Belarusian territory, or Ukraine would take action itself. A week, a specific deadline, aimed not at Vladimir Putin, but at Alexander Lukashenko, the man who has ruled Belarus since 1994 and who has spent 4 years insisting, publicly and repeatedly, that his country wants nothing to do with this war. Belarus, a close Russian ally, has largely stayed out of the conflict since 2022, while calling on Moscow and Kyiv to engage in dialogue and expressing its readiness to contribute to a diplomatic resolution, stayed out of the conflict. That has been the official Belarusian position since 2022, and for years, the world has largely accepted it, because Belarusian troops never crossed into Ukraine, and the involvement that did exist, hosting Russian forces, allowing missile launches, looked passive rather than active. Zelenskyy just told the world that passive support is no longer acceptable. And 1 week later, something happens that almost nobody predicted with this much speed. Communications equipment that Ukraine says was helping support Russian drone strikes from Belarusian territory has stopped operating, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy told reporters. On June 24th, days after issuing an ultimatum to Belarusian ruler Alexander Lukashenko, it worked. Or at least, something happened that looks exactly like it worked. And to understand what that tells us, we need to go back to where Belarus's role in this war actually started. Belarus, in February 2022, was not a passive participant. It was ground zero. The Ukrainian president said Russia had used Belarusian territory from the earliest days of the full-scale invasion, recalling that missiles launched from Belarus struck targets inside Ukraine. Russian armored columns crossed directly from Belarusian territory toward Kyiv in the opening days of the war. Belarus was the staging ground for the assault on the Ukrainian capital that failed within weeks. Lukashenko allowed his country to become the northern jaw of a pincer that was supposed to close around Kyiv before Ukraine could organize a defense. That assault failed. And in the years since, Belarus's role has evolved from primary staging ground into something quieter, harder to photograph, and easier for Minsk to deny. In his comments, the Ukrainian president accused Belarus of hosting repeaters, relay nodes that are used to boost video signals between drone pilots and the UAVs themselves on its territory that assist, with Russian drone strikes on Ukrainian territory, relay stations, not tanks, not troops, communications towers in the Gomel and Brest regions, repeating signals that allow Russian Shahed and Gerbera drones flying toward Ukraine to maintain their connection with operators over distances that would otherwise break the link. Russian forces, like the Ukrainian armed forces, use mesh networks for video communication with drones. UAVs equipped with cameras and specialized modems act as airborne relay stations for one another, allowing communication to be maintained over dozens or hundreds of kilometers. This is a technical detail that matters enormously. Belarus is not driving the drones. Belarus is hosting the infrastructure that helps drones launched from Russia find their way deeper into Ukraine. It is support, but indirect, technical, and deniable support. Exactly the kind of contribution that lets a government say it is not part of the war while materially assisting the side it favors. Zelenskyy also highlighted Belarus's growing role as a supplier to the Russian military. He noted that gasoline deliveries from Belarus to Russia increased 13-fold in the first 5 months of 2026 compared to the same period last year, while diesel supplies tripled. 13 times more gasoline, 3 times more diesel. Belarusian factories producing components for Russian armored vehicles and missile systems. None of this is Belarusian soldiers crossing a border. All of it is Belarus functioning as Russia's logistics backbone, fuel depot, and industrial supplier, while maintaining the diplomatic fiction of neutrality. So why issue this ultimatum now, in June 2026, rather than at any point in the previous 4 years? The honest answer involves both a trigger and a capability shift happening simultaneously. The trigger was a specific atrocity. Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy has issued an ultimatum to Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, threatening him with military action if Belarus fails to dismantle the communication stations along its southern border, just days after a deadly Ukrainian drone strike on a bus carrying a children's soccer team from the country. Wait, read that carefully. A Ukrainian drone strike hit a bus carrying a children's soccer team, with the attack actually occurring inside Russia's Bryansk region, killing a Belarusian coach's wife and injuring 6 children. This detail, reported by Russian state media RT, frames the sequence differently than the Western coverage. Russia's narrative says Ukraine struck a civilian bus near Belarus. Ukraine's narrative says Belarus is enabling drone strikes on Ukrainian civilians. Both narratives are being used by their respective sides to justify escalation against the other. This is the fog that surrounds every claim in this war, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it. Lukashenko's anger about the bus strike and Zelensky's anger about the relay stations are not necessarily describing the same reality, but they are feeding off each other in a single week of rising rhetoric. The capability shift is the more strategically important development. As Ukraine continues its long-range strike campaign into Russia, its president warned on Friday that his forces may also begin targeting Belarus. Ukraine's deployment of mid-range and long-range drones, the same systems now striking refineries 800 kilometers inside Russia, the Flamingo cruise missile with its massive warhead, the Shahed and Gerbera analogs Ukraine has developed, have made an attack on Belarusian territory operationally realistic for the first time. Before this capability existed, threatening Belarus was empty rhetoric. Ukraine simply did not have the reach or the assets to spare for a second front against a country that was not the primary combatant. When the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces said that they have identified 500 targets on Belarusian territory and that, "We know where Lukashenko is," Lukashenko responded. That Ukraine may have identified 500 targets, but we have one very serious target with precise coordinates. Bloomberg, 500 targets identified, and a not-so-subtle threat exchanged about precise coordinates on each other's leaders. This is the language of genuine deterrence signaling, not performative posturing. Both sides are telling each other, specifically, that they know where the other one lives. Now to the central question. Was this ultimatum meaningless cheap talk, or a credible threat that forced real change? The most honest answer is probably somewhere in between, and the outcome so far supports the credible enough to work interpretation. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Belarus has stopped using retransmitters that Russia relied on to guide Shahed drones toward targets in Ukraine. Citing reports from Ukraine's commander-in-chief and intelligence services, he said the system ceased operating on Belarusian territory on Monday, just days after he issued a public ultimatum. Whether it has been dismantled or not, I honestly don't know yet. The fact is that, as of today, the equipment is no longer operating. Zelenskyy himself is being careful here. He is not claiming total victory. He is claiming the equipment stopped transmitting. That is a meaningfully different claim than Belarus dismantled everything we demanded. It could mean Lukashenko ordered a shutdown to avoid Ukrainian strikes. It could mean Russia, recognizing the political cost to Lukashenko, voluntarily rerouted its drone guidance through other channels. It could even be temporary, switched off during the period of maximum scrutiny and ready to resume once attention moves elsewhere. Putin probably has alternative systems in place and told Lukashenko to agree so as to appease Zelenskyy. This is a genuinely plausible reading, and a realistic analysis has to take it seriously. Russia's drone guidance architecture almost certainly does not depend entirely on these specific Belarusian relay towers. Shahed and Gerbera drones use mesh networking, where each drone in a swarm can relay signal for others, reducing dependence on any single ground station. If Russia has redundancy built into the system, switching off the Belarusian relays costs Russia little while giving Lukashenko a face-saving way to claim compliance without truly disarming. Ukrainian border guards have recorded a drop in the number of Russian attack drones entering northern Chernihiv Oblast, while large Shahed drone raids along the Belarus-Ukraine border have ceased. This is the strongest evidence that something real changed. A measurable drop in drone activity along a specific border region is harder to fake than a press statement. Whether this reduction is permanent or temporary, it is at minimum a genuine observable shift in the operational pattern that followed Zelenskyy's deadline. What was Ukraine's actual menu of options if Belarus had not complied? And what does the choice of language tell us about Kyiv's real intentions? Option 1 was doing nothing, treating the ultimatum as a bluff designed purely to pressure Belarus into self-correcting. The evidence suggests this was never Ukraine's preferred outcome going into the deadline, but it has effectively become the outcome anyway, since Belarus appears to have complied without forcing Ukraine to act. Option 2 was striking the specific Russian military assets and relay infrastructure inside Belarus, a narrow, targeted action designed to eliminate the exact equipment Zelenskyy named, rather than a broader campaign against the Belarusian state. This is the option, most consistent with everything Zelenskyy said publicly. He repeatedly specified relay towers in Gomel and Brest, not Belarusian military bases, not Belarusian government buildings, not population centers. The specificity of the threat was itself a form of restraint, designed to make compliance easy and to make any Ukrainian response, if it came, narrowly justifiable under international norms about third-party territory being used to facilitate attacks on a neutral country. Option 3, striking broader Belarusian infrastructure, such as oil refining or fuel supply chains that feed Russia's war effort, carried far higher escalation risk. He noted that gasoline deliveries from Belarus to Russia increased 13-fold in the first 5 months of 2026. This fuel pipeline is a legitimate military target by the logic of total war economics, but striking it would mean attacking Belarusian civilian energy infrastructure, almost certainly producing Belarusian civilian casualties, and creating exactly the kind of direct war between Ukraine and Belarus that NATO countries bordering Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia are desperate to avoid. The real risk of a widening war at the moment comes from Ukraine, and on two fronts, the Baltic states and Belarus. On May 19th, a Romanian F-16 fighter jet based in Lithuania shot down a Ukrainian drone in Estonian airspace after it had flown through Latvian airspace. This detail is genuinely alarming and deserves more attention than it typically receives. NATO aircraft are already shooting down Ukrainian drones that stray into Baltic airspace en route to or from Russian and Belarusian targets. Every Ukrainian strike deep into Belarus increases the geographic spread of drone debris, jamming interference and airspace incursions that could eventually draw NATO members into a direct, accidental confrontation that nobody intended. Is there a legal or normative basis for Ukraine to strike targets inside Belarus, a country it is not formally at war with? International law on this question is genuinely murky, and the honest answer is that Ukraine's justification rests on a real but contested legal principle. A state that allows its territory to be used to facilitate attacks against another state has, under traditional just war theory and certain interpretations of customary international law, forfeited some of the protections of neutrality. Belarus hosting the launch point for the 2022 invasion of Kyiv, continuing to host Relay. Infrastructure for ongoing drone strikes, and supplying fuel and military components to Russia's war effort are all facts that weaken Minsk's claim to genuine non-belligerent status. While there is intelligence sharing between Russia and Belarus, some of which is being used to help Russian forces with drone targeting, the scope and impact are not as strategically important as Ukraine is suggesting. This is an important counterpoint from independent analysts at Responsible Statecraft, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Some experts believe Ukraine may be overstating the strategic significance of these relay stations specifically to build public and legal justification for striking Belarus, separate from whatever military value the strikes would actually produce. If true, the ultimatum may have functioned more as psychological and diplomatic pressure on Lukashenko than as a response to a genuinely decisive piece of military infrastructure. What does Lukashenko's own behavior during this episode tell us about where Belarus actually stands? Lukashenko said his comments had been a response to what he described as threats from Ukraine, including statements that Kyiv had identified hundreds of potential targets in Belarus and knew his whereabouts. If Volodymyr was offended, I apologize to him for these words, Lukashenko said, adding that he may have spoken too harshly given Ukraine's ongoing war against Russia. Lukashenko apologizing to Zelenskyy, publicly. This is not the behavior of a leader confident in Moscow's protection or eager for confrontation. This is the behavior of a man trying urgently to de-escalate a threat he takes seriously. A senior U.S. State Department authority, Jeremy Levin, says Ukraine has turned the situation around and is currently in a phase where it is winning the war against Russia. If Lukashenko shares this read of the battlefield trajectory, even partially, his calculation about the wisdom of further entangling Belarus with a losing Russian war effort changes substantially. The Belarusian opposition, exiled and operating from outside the country, is warning of exactly the opposite trajectory that Lukashenko's public apology suggests: constitutional changes, military expansion, deeper arms integration with Russia. These long-term structural shifts could mean Lukashenko's conciliatory words towards Zelenskyy are tactical theater, designed to buy time and reduce immediate Ukrainian pressure, while Belarus continues a slower, quieter drift toward deeper Russian military integration. So where does this leave the realistic assessment of what comes next? The ultimatum appears, on the available evidence, to have achieved its immediate, narrow objective. The specific relay equipment Zelenskyy named has gone quiet, and drone activity along the relevant border sector has measurably dropped. That is a real, verifiable result, not empty rhetoric. But the deeper strategic question, whether Belarus is moving toward genuine neutrality or merely performing compliance while Russia adapts around it, remains unresolved. Putin and Lukashenko plan to meet in the near future to discuss Zelenskyy's warning to Minsk. That meeting, whenever it happens, will tell us more about the durability of this outcome than anything said this week. If Putin instructs Lukashenko to quietly restore the equipment once international attention fades, the compliance was theater. If Putin accepts the shutdown as the cost of avoiding a second front that Russia, already stretched thin and suffering nearly 1.4 million total casualties since the invasion began, genuinely cannot afford to open, then this episode represents something more significant. The first time Ukraine successfully coerced a third-party state into reducing its material support for Russia's war effort through the credible threat of direct military action. That would be a meaningful precedent, not because Belarus has become Ukraine's friend, but because it would demonstrate that Ukraine's expanding strike capability has created a deterrent effect that reaches beyond Russia's own borders, into the territory of states that have spent 4 years believing their passive support for Moscow was cost-free and consequence-free. The towers in Gomel and Brest may be silent today. Whether they stay that way is the real test still to come.